greatest inventor you've never heard of. There's a famous test, originally developed by the psychologist J.P. Guilford, which gives an idea of how creative a person is. You ask them to think of as many uses as possible for an everyday object. A brick, a glass, a shoe, that kind of thing. The idea is that the more ideas you come up with, they call that fluency, plus the number of different categories of idea, that's what they call flexibility, it gives an idea of your ability to think creatively. Now, if we tried that test with a simple safety pin, it'd certainly trigger some of the usual suspects. A nappy pin, or diaper if you're in the US, a clothes fastener, maybe a little simple medical device, or an item of jewellery. But not so frequent a visitor to many people's lists might be a weightlifting aid. And yet arguably that's been its most glorious moment so far. For one very good reason. Now, a $15 debt is not a big deal, even if it is incurred in 1849 when its value would be around $600 in today's money. An annoyance, certainly, but not likely to bring on imminent bankruptcy if it remained unpaid. But for Walter Hunt, there was a principle involved. He was, by all accounts, a very moral man. And there was also the practical consideration that his relationship with his creditor, one J.R. Chapin, mattered. Chapin had helped him with a number of other projects as a draughtsman, providing the technical drawings needed for his patent applications. So Walter Hunt duly worried about how he was going to repay this debt. A period of hand-wringing and fiddling which lasted about 3 hours, during some of which time he picked up a piece of wire to keep his hands busy. And then he came up with the basic and still powerful principle behind the mechanism of the safety pin. Most pins up to that point were either simple and sharp with a point at one end, or they were loops which came undone easily. They hadn't changed much since the days when Roman legionaries pinned their cloaks with a fibula, which is a kind of simple brooch clasp pin. But Walter Hunt, by coiling the wire on itself, created a simple spring mechanism, and he put a catch at one end so that he was able to make the safe closure mechanism which we've come to know and love. Quite a lot of us, in fact. Estimates put the number of safety pins produced and sold per year around the world at around 1 billion, with specialised machines now capable of turning out millions of safety pins every day. Now, Walter Hunt wasn't a fool. He recognised that this idea could have value. And he wasn't inexperienced. He already had a healthy track record of successful innovation behind him. He knew how to work the patent system. So he duly filed and was awarded patent number US 6281A. And he then offered this and the accompanying rights that it conferred to the W.R. Grace Company, who snapped it up, excuse the pun, paying Hunt the princely sum of $400, which was enough to enable him to settle his debt and have some spare capital, and also to lift a small but annoying weight from his shoulders. It turned out to be quite a good deal for the Grace Company. On an initial outlay of $400, that's about $15,000 in today's money, they secured profits running into millions of dollars over the next years. But for Walter Hunt, this kind of thing was second nature. He had a gift for seeing and solving problems in a practical way. By 1849, he'd already built a legacy of mostly useful items, which he'd mostly patented, and he'd got a growing reputation as an inventor, though not necessarily as an innovator, as in someone who can create value from their ideas. Hunt seems to have had a second, gift, if you can call it that, in addition to being a visionary inventor, he seems to have been cursed with the inability to profit from his adventures. In fact, if you look back at his track record of invention, he rapidly emerges as a serious contender for being the greatest inventor you've never heard of. For example, the repeater rifle in 1848, up there as a symbol of how the West was won in 1,000 cowboy movies, and undoubtedly the making of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The Winchester rifle. Hunt, in fact, not only developed the original idea for a volition repeating rifle, but also put the ammunition in place. The ammunition he might use was his rocket ball, revolutionary in that it put the powder charge in the base of the bullet. Now, his ideas weren't necessarily very workable. They needed a lot of knocking into shape for production, and so he sold the patents. These changed hands a number of times in the growing armaments industry before being bought by Messrs. Smith and Wesson, who used them as the basis for forming a new company. And the biggest investor in the new volcanic repeating arms company, one Oliver Winchester. The rest is, as they say, history. Or think of fountain pens and writing implements and the transition from goose quills to refillable devices. You might well think of the companies which made their name with such innovation. And indeed, whilst companies like Parker Pen created the market, the foundations for it were laid by, amongst others, Walter Hunt. He predated their work by decades. In 1847, he patented a fountain pen, that's US Patent 4927, which combined the inkstand and the pen into one unit, convenient for the pocket. Or knife sharpening, nail making, rope making, casters to help move furniture around, disposable paper collars, a coal-burning stove which would radiate heat in all directions, a saw for cutting down trees more effectively, a flexible spring attachment for belt and braces, an attachment for boats to cut through ice, an inkstand, a non-explosive safety lamp, bottle stoppers. Hunt turned his hand and imagination to hundreds of challenges across an almost impossibly wide spectrum. Leonardo da Vinci would have been proud of him, not least in his ability to draw together ideas and inspirations from many different fields. His first patented invention was for an improved flax spinning machine in 1826. He was at that time working as a farmer in a region dominated by textile milling, and most of his family and friends were in the business of spinning wool and cotton. Now, faced with rising costs and falling product prices, the local mill owner, Willis Hoskins, wanted to reduce wages. Hunt persuaded him to hold off, offering instead to develop a more efficient flax spinning machine. He patented this on June the 22nd, 1826, and its contribution to improved productivity helped save the local jobs. Actually, his motivation was often underpinned by social concern. Another early invention, this one in 1827, was for a coach alarm system. Hunt had been visiting New York to try and raise funds for developing his flax spinning machine further when he saw an accident. A horse-drawn carriage ran over a child. The driver, whose hands were fully occupied with the reins of the team, hadn't been able to sound the warning horn in time. Now, Hunt was shaken by this, and the fact that it wasn't a rare occurrence. So he began thinking of ways to help prevent these accidents. And he came up with the idea of a metal gong with a hammer that could be operated with his foot. The coach alarm. It was patented on July 30th, 1827. But once again, facing an uphill struggle to develop and commercialise this, he sold the rights instead to the stagecoach operators Kip and Brown. His invention became a standard feature on streetcars across the United States, saving countless lives. Late in his life, Hunt addressed the laundry problem. In 1854, a crisp white collar was a mark of status, but keeping that linen white required constant starching and ironing. So Hunt invented the paper shirt collar, and that's patent number 11,376, which offered the advantage of looking like linen but being disposable after use. Now, some of Hunt's ideas were, shall we say, a little fanciful, though the prototypes proved their point. For example, inspired by the way flies negotiated ceilings, his Antipodean apparatus was designed to help circus performers and anyone else mad enough to walk upside down. Although this one wasn't patented, it was still in use by performers 100 years later. Altogether, he was responsible for hundreds of patents, and about 24 of his inventions are still used pretty much in the form in which he created them over 100 years ago, the safety pin being the prime example. Now, those inventions included, of course, the really big one that got away, the sewing machine. The mid-19th century saw a flurry of inventive activity around trying to enable a sewing machine, eventually converging on a dominant design which combined different elements for feeding, sewing with a lockstitch, holding the fabric, powering the feed, and so on. As we know, Isaac Singer walked away with the prize in 1851 after a long and bitter battle with Elias Howe, whose patent he liberally borrowed from, and which predated Singer's machine by several years. What's not always mentioned is that Howe's idea wasn't original. In fact, he'd based his 1846 machine on something he'd seen more than a decade before. In fact, this prior art was what Singer tried to use in his defence, only to have the judge throw it out because the original idea, though clearly the core design for a working sewing machine, had never actually been patented. The man who'd let this incredible opportunity slip through his fingers, you guessed, our very own Walter Hunt. Back in 1830, the Frenchman Barthélemy Timonier had patented a machine that used a hooked needle to make a chain stitch, but it was slow and fragile. Hunt's experiments in the 1830s led him to a new approach. He realised that the machine didn't need to mimic a manual seamstress, and in particular, it didn't need to pass the needle all the way through the cloth. Instead, he designed a curved needle with the eye at the point. The needle would pierce the cloth, carrying a loop of thread with it, and then a shuttle would pass a second thread through the loop formed by the needle. When the needle retracted, the two threads would lock together, the lock stitch. He kept these ideas in his family, employing one of his many brothers, Adoniram, to improve on his wooden prototype by making a prototype machine, out of iron. It worked well, sewing straight steams with a durability and uniformity that manual sewing couldn't touch. By 1834, 12 years before Elias Howe, Hunt had a working machine that could have made him one of the richest men in the world. But he held back from patenting it. Not for want of experience or vision. He'd seen the possibilities, which is why he'd been working on the idea. But his vision was partly shaped by his strong-willed and socially conscious daughter, who saw it not as a labour-saving device, but as a labour killer, threatening the livelihoods of women who worked as seamstresses and who were trying to establish themselves and find a measure of financial independence through that work. She persuaded Hunt to hold back from registering his patent, though he had that working design ready a full 20 years before Singer's successful entry. Instead, he allowed his invention to slumber, as he put it, existing but not being patented or commercialised. Eventually he sold the rights to the prototype to George Arrowsmith, But Arrowsmith had the company, but seeing the lack of a patent, he decided he was also not able to commercialise it. In the infamous sewing machine wars of the early 1850s, the two big antagonists were then Singer and Howe. And as part of his campaign, Singer discovered Hunt's ideas and pressed him to search for any evidence of that earlier machine which might help invalidate Howe's lockstitch-based patent. Eventually they found the rusty remnants of the 1834 machine, and Hunt rebuilt it to working status, enabling Singer in court to argue that Howe was not the first inventor. But in 1854, Patent Commissioner Charles Mason issued a ruling which became a cornerstone of patent law. He acknowledged that Hunt had indeed invented the machine first. However, he ruled against Hunt based on the doctrine of laches, abandonment. And he wrote, "When the first inventor allows his discovery to slumber for 18 years with no probability of it ever being brought into useful activity, and when it is only resurrected to supplant and strangle an invention which has been given to the public, all reasonable presumption should be in favour of the inventor who has been the means of conferring the real benefit upon the world." The ruling forced Singer and other sewing machine manufacturers to settle their differences and operate a patent pool, with each paying relevant royalties to the others for their particular intellectual property. So Howe and many others benefited. Hunt, however, received a small payment from Singer for his testimony, but missed out on those royalties, the ones that built the fortunes which came to Singer and to Howe. Hunt was granted a patent for another improvement to the machine, dealing with the feeding of material into it without jamming it. And Singer reluctantly but eventually agreed in 1858 to pay Hunt $50,000 for this design. Unfortunately, Hunt didn't live long enough to collect his due. He died on June the 8th, 1859, of pneumonia in his workshop in New York City. His grave in Greenwood Cemetery is marked by a modest granite stone, a stark contrast to the massive monuments of other Gilded Age entrepreneurs. But although Hunt had died without a fortune to his name, he wasn't a fool. His name might be missing from the pantheon of great inventors who've changed the world through steel and steam, creating those products and markets which defined a new industrial age. Yet anyone who could twist a piece of wire into a global success in 3 hours in order to settle a debt probably still deserves a much closer look. The man who was labelled a Yankee mechanical genius was born in 1796 in Lewis County, New York, to a Quaker family. The eldest of 13 children, he was lucky to receive an education, but he went on to earn a master's degree in masonry at the age of 21. Now, although a practical skill much needed in a rural farming community, masonry also involves a way of thinking which is much more than simply piling stones on top of each other. Arguably, his understanding of interdependence and systems derived in part from this early experience, and maybe that helped enable him to approach widely different problems with a sense of their underlying similarities. Now, his life reveals a complex man of high principles, a benevolent Quaker as he was described, and possessed of an internal motivation owing much more to a fascination with solving problems and puzzles rather than the inspiration of a possible fortune. Someone who found joy in the quest rather than the goal, the ultimate ideas man. An obituary published in the New York Tribune on June the 13th, 1859, captured a little of this restless spirit. They wrote, "For more than 40 years he's been known as an experiment in the arts. Whether in mechanical movements, chemistry, electricity or metallic compositions, he was always at home. And probably in all, he has tried more experiments than any other inventor. Maybe worth a second look next time you're pinning a nappy or using a safety pin in one of those other applications.